The type was scattered across the floor of the Redemption Gazette when Virginia Walker threw the compositor's stick directly at Clark Donnelly's chest. It struck him square in the sternum, and little lead letters exploded everywhere, bouncing off the floorboards like hailstones, skittering beneath the press and into the corners, the letter O rolling all the way to the door as if trying to escape the fury building between them. Clark did not flinch. He stood with his arms at his sides, his jaw set like iron, his dark eyes watching her with an expression she could not read and hated herself for wanting to. "You killed it," Virginia said, and her voice did not shake, which was its own small miracle because every other part of her was trembling. "You killed the story, the one story that mattered. You killed it without telling me, without asking me, without so much as a knock on the door." "I didn't kill it," Clark said quietly. "I pulled it. That is the same thing. It is not the same thing, and you know it. You had no right." She stepped toward him, and the scent of ink was thick in the air between them, iron and oil and something older, the smell of words waiting to become true. "You had no right to touch my work, not without my permission, not without." "He would have burned this building to the ground, Virginia." Clark's voice stayed low, but something in it caught, some small thread that she could hear fraying, and it stopped her cold. "He would have burned it down with you inside it. Do you understand that? With you inside it. And I would have been standing in the street watching the smoke." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything they had not yet said to each other, everything that had been building since the morning 4 months ago when she stepped off the stage in Redemption, Kansas, with a printer's box tucked under one arm, a carpetbag in the other hand, and opinions sharp enough to cut glass about 3 different things before she had even found the boarding house. She had not come to Redemption looking for Clark Donnelly. She had come because the town had no newspaper, and a town without a newspaper was a town that kept its secrets in the dark, and Virginia Walker had made it her life's mission, since she was 19 years old and setting type in her father's shop in Cincinnati, to drag secrets into the light regardless of who they belonged to or how much those people wanted them kept. She was 26 now. She had worked at the Cincinnati Register until her father sold it to a man who believed women should not write editorials. She had worked at the St. Louis Courier until the editor discovered she had sourced a story about city corruption directly from a city alderman's private correspondence, which she had not stolen, but had been given by the alderman's wife, who believed the public deserved to know. They let her go with a week's pay and a reference letter that was technically accurate but carefully worded to discourage future employers. She had heard about Redemption from a woman named Hattie Calloway, who ran a dry goods operation out of Abilene. Hattie had cousins in Redemption. Hattie said the town was growing fast, that there were cattle interests and farming interests and railroad interests all converging on the same piece of Kansas ground, and that without a newspaper, the only voices that got heard were the ones belonging to men who could afford to shout loudest. Virginia had taken that as an invitation. She arrived on a Tuesday in April of 1879 with $4.30, the printer's box her father had given her when she turned 21, a portable case of type that she had been adding to for 5 years, and opinions about the following 3 things, which she would share with anyone who asked and several people who did not. The obligation of the press to speak plainly about power, the right of every citizen regardless of race or sex to cast an informed vote, and the correct way to make cornbread, which should under no circumstances contain sugar. The cornbread opinion was the one that broke the ice with Mabel Greer, who ran the boarding house on Sycamore Street and who had her own cornbread convictions, and was initially hostile to Virginia's presence until their debate on the subject lasted an hour and ended in mutual respect, and Mabel offering her a room at a reduced rate in exchange for Virginia printing the boarding house menus and a monthly notice of rooms available. The vote opinion was the one that got her thrown out of the Redemption City Council's first public meeting, which she attended as a member of the press. She was not allowed back in after that, which she noted in the first issue of the Redemption Clarion, which she had named herself and founded herself, and which she printed on a press she had managed to acquire from a man named Elias Prout, who was closing his feed store, and had inexplicably also owned a small flatbed printing press, which he sold to her for $12, which nearly wiped out her reserves, but which she considered the best $12 she had ever spent. The press opinion, the one about the obligation to speak plainly about power, was the one that brought her into direct and immediate conflict with Harlan Doyle. Harlan Doyle owned 60% of the land surrounding Redemption. He owned the largest cattle operation in the county. He owned the bank. He did not technically own the sheriff, but he funded the sheriff's election campaign and seemed to be under the impression that this amounted to the same thing. He was 53 years old, powerful in the particular way that men become powerful when they have never once in their adult lives been told no by anyone who could not subsequently be ruined for having said it. Virginia had met him at a social gathering at the Methodist Church 3 weeks after her arrival, when the Clarion had already published 2 issues and people were starting to talk about it. Doyle had shaken her hand with the particular firmness of a man who wants you to understand that he could crush your fingers if he chose not to. And he had said, smiling, that he was always glad to see entrepreneurial spirit in young women, and that he hoped the little newspaper was a hobby that brought her joy. Virginia had said, also smiling, that it was not a hobby, it was a business, and that she hoped to report on Mr. Doyle's considerable influence on county land allocation in an upcoming issue. The smile had not left Doyle's face, but something behind it had gone very cold, very still in a way that she had recognized because she had seen it before in men who were used to getting what they wanted. "I hope you'll make sure you have your facts straight," he said. "I always do," she said. She had the facts straight. That was the problem. She had been gathering them for 6 weeks, talking to farmers who had lost grazing rights they had held for years, talking to the county clerk who was nervous enough to only speak in generalities but whose generalities pointed clearly in one direction, talking to a former hand from Doyle's ranch named Jesse Watkins who had seen documents he was not supposed to see and who had agreed to speak on the record. She had the story set in type and ready to print the morning Clark Donnelly had pulled it. Clark Donnelly was not what she had expected when she met him, which was a problem she kept having with Clark, who consistently failed to be what she expected. He was the proprietor of Donnelly's Hardware and Lumber on Main Street, which was the largest business in Redemption by square footage and the one that everyone eventually needed. He had been in Redemption 7 years, having come from Missouri after the war, which he did not discuss. He was 31 years old, which she had found out from Mabel and not from him. He was tall and broad-shouldered with dark brown hair and eyes that were the particular shade of brown that seemed lighter or darker depending on his mood, which was something she had noticed entirely against her will. He had come into the Clarion office on the second day it was open, not to place an advertisement as she assumed, but to look at the press. He had stood in front of her father's old compositor's stand and looked at the type cases with an expression she could only describe as recognition, and she had said, somewhat defensively because she was used to people underestimating the operation, that she had been setting type since she was 12. "My uncle had a paper in Jefferson City," Clark had said. "I used to help him when I was young, before the war. Did you like it?" She had asked, and she had not been sure why she asked it, except that there was something in his voice when he said before the war that made her want to understand what came after. "I liked that it felt like it mattered," he said. "Every word you said in type, it was permanent, or as permanent as anything gets." She had not known what to say to that, which was unusual for her. She had offered him coffee, which was the second unusual thing, because she was not in the habit of offering people coffee in the middle of her workday. He had accepted. They had talked for an hour and a half about the printing trade and the history of Kansas, and the question of whether Redemption had the population base to sustain a weekly paper, and she had told him she intended to find out, and he had looked at her with that expression she could not read, and said that he believed she probably would. He had placed an advertisement for Donnelly's hardware in the first issue. He had come in to pay for it in person, which was unusual. Most advertisers sent someone. He had stayed longer than was strictly necessary to complete the transaction. She had not mentioned it to anyone, including herself. The second month, he had started coming in on Saturday mornings, ostensibly to pay for the following week's advertisement, but also, increasingly, to read the proofs before they went to press, which she allowed because his eye for errors was genuinely useful, and because she told herself it was a strictly professional arrangement that benefited the paper. He had opinions of his own, which surprised her. Not about the news itself, but about the telling of it. He would read a sentence and say things like, "That buries the lead," or "You're being too careful here, say what you think." And she would argue with him because she argued with everyone, but she noticed that more often than not he was right, and that when she took his suggestion the piece became cleaner and stronger, and she began to look forward to Saturday mornings with an enthusiasm she carefully did not examine. He fixed the press in the third week. She had not asked him to. There was a problem with the platen mechanism that meant uneven inking, and she had been managing around it, shimming the paper carrier with folded card stock. He had come in one Saturday morning, looked at it for 2 minutes, gone back to his hardware store, returned with 3 different tools and a replacement part he had apparently fabricated himself from flat iron stock, and had the press running perfectly within 45 minutes, refusing payment and accepting coffee. She had said, "You didn't have to do that." He had said, "The paper needed to be printed properly." She had understood that this was not the full reason. They did not discuss that understanding. They were both people who understood things and did not discuss them, which was its own kind of intimacy, a shared language of things left unsaid but fully known. Virginia was more practiced at saying difficult things than most people she had met, but there was a category of difficult thing that was different from reporting on land corruption or writing editorials about women's suffrage, and she found herself less practiced in that category than she had believed. The story on Harlan Doyle had taken shape through April and May. Virginia had been thorough. She had cross-referenced Doyle's land acquisition dates against county records. She had interviewed Jesse Watkins twice and had his testimony confirmed by a second source, a farmwife named Adeline Marsh, whose family had been pushed off their grazing allotment through what Doyle's lawyers called a technical dispute, and what anyone looking at the paperwork would call intimidation. She had requested comment from Doyle's office and received a letter from his attorney, suggesting that printing unsubstantiated claims about a private citizen would constitute defamation, and that the Redemption Clarion would be well advised to confine itself to social notices and agricultural news. She had filed the attorney's letter with a note of its date, and then continued reporting. Clark had known about the story. She had told him because she told him things she did not tell other people, which she also did not examine. He had not told her not to print it. He had listened carefully and asked questions that were good questions, the kind that made her think harder about the story rather than less. He had said, 3 weeks before she set the final version in type, that Doyle was not a man who accepted exposure gracefully, and that she should consider what protections she had in place. She had said she had the truth. He had said, carefully, that the truth was not always sufficient protection. She had said she was aware of that but had chosen to be in this business anyway. He had looked at her for a long moment with those eyes that shifted with his mood, and he had said, quietly, "I know you have. I just want to know you've thought about what happens after." She had told him she had thought about it. That was not entirely accurate. She had thought about the story. She had thought about the people who needed the story to be told. She had thought about what it would mean for redemption if Doyle's practices were never brought into the public record. She had thought somewhat less than she should have about what Harlan Doyle might do when he saw his name in print, above a documented account of what amounted to systematic theft from smaller landholders. The morning Clark had pulled the story, he had come to the office before she arrived. She had come in at 7 to find the forms cleared, the type redistributed, a blank space where the front page lead should have been. She had known immediately what had happened. She had known, before she even asked, that it was Clark. He was the only other person who had a key to the building, which she had given him 2 weeks earlier when the press had developed a problem with ink consistency that he was helping her diagnose on a schedule that involved him stopping by at odd hours. She had gone directly to his hardware store. He had told her plainly. Watkins had come to him the night before. Not to Virginia, to Clark, because Watkins was afraid of what Virginia would do with the information, which was printed immediately, which was exactly what she intended to do. Watkins had received a visit from 2 men he did not know, men who worked for Doyle, who had made clear in careful and deniable language that speaking on record to the Clarion about Harlan Doyle would be a decision with lasting consequences for Watkins's health and the health of his family. Watkins was recanting. Without his testimony, the story had 1 confirmed source instead of 2, and while the documentary evidence was still solid, Virginia knew that Doyle's lawyers would attack the sourcing the moment the paper hit the street, and that without Watkins's account, the attack would find more purchase than she wanted. She had understood all of this. She had gone back to the office and picked up the compositor's stick and thrown it at Clark Donnelly, which brought them to the moment of silence full of all the unsaid things. "I need you to understand," Virginia said, and her voice was steady now, steady with the effort of making it so, "that pulling that story was not your decision to make. Not legally, not ethically. This is my paper, my press, my type." "I know that," Clark said. He did not move. He stood among the scattered lead letters like a man who had decided to stay in a particular place and would not be moved from it. "I know all of that, and I know that what I did was outside the bounds of what you would have permitted if I'd asked. I'm not going to pretend otherwise." "Then why?" "Because Doyle knew the story was coming." Clark's voice was even, but his eyes were not. There was something moving behind them, something that cost him something to hold still. Someone told him the specifics, not just that you were investigating, the specifics. Which means he has a source close to the paper. And what he told his men to say to Watkins, it wasn't just a warning about Watkins. He told them to say that the woman running the Clarion was going to find out what it meant to print lies about respectable men. Virginia was quiet. "He used the word burn," Clark said. "According to Watkins, he used that word specifically." The weight of it settled on her slowly, not panic but something more considered, the process of understanding a threat that was real and not abstract. She had known there would be opposition. She had not known it would be specific enough to include the word burn. "You could have told me," she said. "You could have come to me with this. I came to you with Doyle's attorney's letter and you filed it and kept reporting. That was true, she did not dispute it. So you thought the only option was to go behind my back. I thought the only option that kept you from being in a burning building was removing the immediate provocation long enough for us to figure out something better." He paused. "I was wrong about the method. I should have come to you first. I know that. But I was not wrong about the danger." She looked at him. At his jaw that was still set like iron but was not hard, the way iron is not hard when it is also honest. At his hands, which were the hands of a man who worked with them, and also, she knew now, of a man who had once set type in his uncle's newspaper in Jefferson City before whatever had come after the war had brought him to Redemption to sell lumber and hardware and read proofs on Saturday mornings, and apparently also to redistribute her type in the night because he was afraid she would be in a burning building. "We have to print it," she said. "We have to print it more than ever now. If we pull it, he wins. And more than that, if he gets away with silencing it, the next thing that needs to be said in this town will be quieter before it's even written." Clark was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know. So you understand we have to print it." "I understand we have to print something," he said, "and I think there's a way to do it that doesn't involve you being the only person standing between Doyle and the paper." She looked at him carefully. "What are you suggesting?" he told her. What Clark Donnelly suggested was not simple and was not comfortable, and involved him doing something he had apparently been considering for some time, which was becoming publicly associated with the Clarion in a way that made him a co-target of any retaliation Doyle might direct at the paper. He intended to list himself on the masthead, not as editor, which was Virginia's role, but as publisher, which was a term that in the small press context of 1879 Kansas carried the meaning of "I am also standing here, and if you come for this newspaper, you come for me too." Virginia's first instinct was to refuse. The paper was hers. She had built it herself. She had hauled the press and sourced the type and gone door to door to sell the first round of subscriptions and written every word of the first 6 issues single-handedly. She did not need Clark Donnelly's name on her masthead to make it legitimate. Her second instinct, which arrived about 4 seconds behind the first, was that this was not about legitimacy. It was about arithmetic. Harlan Doyle was not going to attack a newspaper owned by a single woman from Cincinnati with a $12 press. He was going to attack a newspaper associated with Clark Donnelly, who had been in redemption 7 years, and who had built a business that half the town depended on for building supplies, and whose refusal to be intimidated would be considerably more visible and considerably more costly to Doyle than any threat he could credibly make against Virginia. It was, she acknowledged to herself with some difficulty, smart. "You understand this puts you at risk," she said. "Yes," he said. "He could try to damage your business. Encourage people not to trade with you." "He could try," Clark said, in a tone that suggested he had considered this and had reached a conclusion about it. "Why would you do this?" she asked, and she meant the question to be practical, to be about strategy, but something in her voice was not entirely practical, and she heard it, and she suspected he heard it too. He looked at her for a long moment. The morning light was coming through the east window of the Clarion office, falling across the scattered type on the floor, all those small lead letters waiting to become words. He looked at the floor and then back at her, and he said, "Because everything you've been writing in this paper since April is true and necessary, and this town is better for it being printed, and because I won't stand by and let someone take that from redemption." He paused. "Or from you," he said. Virginia looked at the scattered type. She looked at the press that he had fixed, that was running perfectly because he had fabricated a replacement part from flat iron stock. She looked at him. "I'm going to reset the story," she said, "tonight, and we are going to print it on Thursday together, and your name will be on the masthead." "Yes," he said. "And Clark," she said, and he looked at her, "if you ever touch my type without my permission again, I will throw more than a compositor's stick." For the first time that morning something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but the arrangement that happened around his eyes before a smile, the precursor to it, the weather before the weather. "Understood," he said. They reset the story that evening. Virginia worked the compositor's stick, and Clark worked the galley trays, and they did not talk much, but it was the comfortable kind of quiet that she had come to associate with his presence. The kind where silence was not absence, but something more like a shared room. She set the type by lamplight, and he held the lamp when she needed both hands, and she caught him reading the lines as she set them, his lips moving slightly, not the way people move their lips when they are reading, but the way people move their lips when they are tasting something, testing the words. "This sentence," he said once, pointing. "You can cut the word however. The sense is already implied." She looked at it. He was right. She removed the type for however and tightened the line. At some point she realized they were standing very close together, closer than was required by the practical dimensions of the compositing stand, and that she was aware of the warmth of him on her left side and the particular rhythm of his breathing, and the fact that he smelled like sawdust and coffee, and the faint iron smell of the type they were working with. She moved 6 inches to the right, and he did not say anything, and neither did she. The Clarion went a press Thursday morning. Virginia had not slept more than 3 hours, but she was awake and fully present for the press run, cranking the impression lever herself on every sheet, watching the ink meet the paper and the words become real and permanent in exactly the way Clark had described them, as permanent as anything gets. His name was on the masthead, directly below hers. Virginia Walker, editor. Clark Donnelly, publisher. She had looked at that line of type longer than was strictly necessary before locking it up. The first copy she folded and left on Harlan Doyle's bank door before dawn. By 8 o'clock, the paper was circulating, and by 9 o'clock Redemption was talking about it. By 10 o'clock Doyle's attorney had appeared at the Clarion office with a letter. Virginia accepted the letter, thanked him for his time, set it aside, and continued stapling copies of the paper. By noon, Clark had come by with lunch, which he had apparently arranged with the restaurant down the street without telling her, and he set it on her work counter and said, "How are you?" "Terrified and elated," she said honestly. "That sounds about right," he said. She ate the lunch. It was the first full meal she had eaten in 2 days, and she had not known how hungry she was until she started eating, and he watched her eat with an expression that she did not have a category for, something careful and warm and private, something that he was not trying to hide but also was not stating. "The town is with us," he said. "More than you might expect. I've had 6 people come in the store this morning and mention the paper. 4 of them said they'd had their own problems with Doyle at some point. One of them, old Henry Marsh, said he's been waiting 3 years for someone to put it in writing. Henry Marsh, the husband of Adeline Marsh, one of her sources. 3 years, Virginia said. People knew, Clark said. They just needed someone to print it. She looked at him. "You knew I would, didn't you? When you first came to the office, you knew what the paper was going to do." He was quiet for a moment. "I hoped," he said. "I hoped someone would come and do what needed doing. I didn't know it would be you. And now that it is." The question hung between them in the warm afternoon air of the office. She had not entirely meant to ask it. It had come out ahead of her intention, which was happening more and more with Clark, and she was not sure whether she was glad of it. He looked at her steadily. "Now that it is," he said, "I'm glad of it." It was not a declaration. It was something quieter than a declaration and somehow larger. "The attorney's letter," she said, returning to safer ground. "Doyle's response will come through legal channels first. He'll try to claim defamation. And you'll demonstrate in court that everything in the piece is documented. Yes, if it gets to court, he may not want a court proceeding. Courts are on the record." Clark nodded. "He may try other methods." "I know," she paused. "I'm not going to pretend I'm not frightened. I want to be honest about that." "Being frightened and being brave are not opposites," Clark said. She looked at him. "My uncle told me that," he said. "About the paper in Jefferson City. They printed something about a city official once. There were consequences." "What happened?" He was quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet when he was deciding whether to open something that was usually kept shut. "Someone broke the windows," he said finally. "Threw rocks. My uncle swept up the glass and reset the press and printed the next issue. He said being frightened and being brave are not opposites. He said they're the same thing, looked at from different angles." Virginia thought about that. "He sounds like someone I would have liked." "You would have," Clark said simply. The legal challenge from Doyle's attorneys came the following week. A formal letter of complaint filed with the county court alleging defamation and malicious publication. Virginia had been expecting it. She had prepared a 30-page response document cross-referencing every claim in the article against its source documentation, and she filed it with the court clerk on the same day she received the challenge. The court clerk, a young man named Robert Beaumont, who had been quietly outraged by Doyle's practices for years but had never had occasion to say so publicly, told her as he stamped her filing that she was doing a brave thing and that he hoped she knew people were paying attention. She printed that in the following issue, attributed and with his permission. Doyle did not burn the Clarion building. What he did, in the weeks that followed, was more methodical. He let it be known in certain circles that businesses advertising in the Clarion might find themselves experiencing difficulties with their bank loans, with which Doyle's bank was the sole regional provider. 3 advertisers pulled their notices. Virginia replaced them within a week by going door to door and explaining the situation with complete transparency, and she gained 4 new advertisers in the process, including Adeline Marsh, who had started a small bakery and who took out a half-column notice for the next 6 months. She wrote about the advertising pressure campaign in the Clarion. She named it clearly for what it was. She documented it with quotes from the businesses who had been pressured, 2 of whom agreed to speak on the record, and 3 of whom she quoted anonymously. That issue sold more copies than any previous issue. Clark came in that Friday evening after she had finished the press run, and she was sitting in the compositor's chair with ink on her hands, and a cup of cold coffee she had forgotten to drink, and she was looking at the first printed copy of the issue with the exhausted satisfaction of someone who had made something real. He knocked on the open door even though it was open, which she had noticed he always did, that particular courtesy of announcing himself in her space rather than assuming the open door was an invitation. "Come in," she said. He came in and looked at the stack of papers and then at her, taking in the ink and the cold coffee and the expression she could not conceal because she was too tired. "You should eat something," he said. "I know." She did not move. He disappeared for 20 minutes and came back with food from the restaurant again. He had done this now 4 times. She had not made it easy, had in fact been something close to prickly about it the first time, pointing out that she was capable of feeding herself, and he had agreed that she was, and then left the food on the counter and gone home, and she had eaten it anyway, and they had never discussed it directly. This time she simply said thank you. He sat across from her at the small table she used for editing, and they ate in that comfortable quiet. The print shop smelled of ink and paper and the faintly sweet oil she used to clean the press. The evening was warm enough that the window was open and they could hear the sounds of Redemption going about its end-of-day business. "I want to tell you something," Clark said when they were nearly finished. She looked at him and waited. "Before I came to Redemption," he said, "I was in a bad place. After the war. I won't go into the detail of it, but it was the kind of bad where you stop being sure what you're building toward." He was looking at his hands, not at her. "I came here because I needed to be somewhere that was still being made, where there was still something to build. Redemption was new enough that it didn't have a shape yet, and I thought I could find a reason here." He paused. "And I did. The business, the community, I found reasons." He looked up at her. "And then you came," he said, "with that compositor's box and your opinions and your printer's box full of type, and you started making the truth public in this town, and I understood something I hadn't known I was waiting to understand." She did not look away. "What?" "That building toward something works better when you can see what you're building toward," he said. "That having a direction matters." It was not a declaration in the traditional sense. Virginia had received a conventional declaration once before in Cincinnati from a man who had used all the right words and meant none of them in the way she needed them to be meant. Clark Donnelly was not using all the right words. He was using honest ones which were better. "I have a direction," she said carefully. "The paper." "I know," he said. "That doesn't change." "I know that too," he said. "I don't want it to change." She looked at him carefully. "Clark," she said and stopped. "Virginia," he said in the same tone. "You understand that I'm not going to become a quieter person," she said. "That I am always going to print things that make powerful people uncomfortable. That this is not a phase of my professional life that I will eventually move past." "I know," he said. "Why would you?" She blinked. It was such a simple answer. It was the answer she had not once received from anyone else in her professional life, not her father when he sold the paper, not the editors who had let her go, not the men who had told her she was very talented for a woman and had meant it as a ceiling. "Most men want women to become quieter," she said. "Most men are afraid of loud women," Clark said. "I spent a year listening to you tell this whole town things it didn't want to hear, and I watched what happened. The town got better. I'm not afraid of that." She was quiet for a long time. The evening sounds from outside, the smell of ink. "I would like to not examine this too quickly," she said finally. "I have a tendency to move fast with everything else, and I would like to practice not doing that with this." "We have time," he said, and there was a warmth in his voice that was not urgent, not pressing, just present. "We're not going anywhere." They were not going anywhere. Redemption was their place now, both of them, and they both knew it. The court case moved slowly, as court cases did in 1879 Kansas. Doyle's attorneys filed motions. Virginia's attorney, a man named Paul Ichter, whom she had hired on contingency, and who had the energy of someone who had been waiting his whole career for exactly this kind of case, filed responses. The court proceedings stretched through June and into July. During those weeks, Virginia and Clark found a rhythm together that was not declared or defined but was understood. He came to the Clarion on Saturday mornings. He sometimes came on Tuesday evenings when she was laying out the following week's issue. He fixed things when they broke and did not make a production of it. She argued with his editing suggestions and took most of them and did not make a production of that either. They ate together several times a week, sometimes at the restaurant and sometimes, on long press days, at the Clarion office with food brought in. She began to understand the shape of him, not just the surface of it, the broad shoulders and the careful hands and the eyes that shifted with his mood, but the depth of it. He had lost his younger brother in the war and carried that loss quietly in a way she recognized, because she had seen it in her father after her mother died. The way grief becomes architecture, becomes the walls of a person rather than something they weep about. He had built Donnelly's hardware not because he was particularly passionate about hardware, but because building materials were what made it possible for other people to build things. And that mattered to him in the same way the press mattered to her, not the object itself, but what it made possible. He was funny, in a dry, understated way that she had not noticed at first because he was not the kind of funny that announced itself. She would notice it half a second after a sentence had passed, the particular angle of something he had said, and the delayed recognition of it made her laugh harder than any obvious joke. He noticed. He seemed pleased by it, in the way people are pleased when they discover that someone understands the particular shape of their humor. She told him things she had not told anyone in Redemption, about Cincinnati, about the Register and why she had left, about the editor at the Courier who had called her reckless when what she had actually been was thorough, and how those two things were confused about each other by men who preferred women to be neither. About her father, whom she loved and who had failed her in a specific way that she had forgiven but not forgotten, the way he had sold the paper without asking her, without considering that she had a stake in it, without even the courtesy of warning. Clark listened to all of this without trying to fix it or to provide a counterargument to her assessment of the people involved. He simply listened, the way she had learned he listened, fully and without reservation, as though everything she said was worth the attention it required. In late July, the court ruled. Doyle's defamation suit was dismissed. The judge, a man named Felix Alderton, who was from Ohio and who had no particular loyalty to Doyle's network of influence, found that the Clarion's reporting had been substantially documented and had been conducted without malice toward Doyle personally. He noted in his ruling that the press played an essential role in democratic society, and that criticism of public-facing individuals based on documented evidence was protected. Virginia read the ruling sitting at her compositor's stand, and she was perfectly composed until she finished the last line, and then she put her face in her hands and shook, not crying exactly, but the body's equivalent of a long breath finally let out. Clark was there. She was not sure exactly when he had come in, but when she took her face out of her hands, he was standing 3 feet from her, and he said quietly, "We won." "We won," she said. "You won," he corrected. "We," she said firmly and looked at him, and something passed between them that had no name yet but had a shape, the shape of two people who had stood in the same direction together when it was difficult and had come through to the other side. He reached across the compositor's stand and took her hand. Just held it. Her hand was ink-stained and so was his, two people who both had the habit of handling type even when the other one was doing the actual work, and they stood there holding ink-stained hands over the compositor's stand for a moment that was quiet and full and entirely sufficient. "Virginia," he said, "Not yet," she said. "Let me say something first." He waited. "I came to Redemption to build something," she said. "The paper, that was the plan, the whole plan. I did not come here to find a person. I need you to know that because I need you to know that when I tell you I've found one anyway, it is not the thing I was looking for. It is something that happened that I did not expect and did not plan and that I have been trying to be careful about because the last time I trusted someone with something personal it went badly." "Who was he?" Clark asked. "A man in Cincinnati," she said. "It doesn't matter who. What matters is that I learned to be careful." "You should be careful," Clark said as if this were obvious and settled. "I am being careful right now." "I know," he said. "So am I, and yet here we are." "Here we are," he agreed. She looked at their hands, still together over the compositor's stand. "I would like to not be careful anymore," she said. "About this." Clark Donnelly looked at her. This woman who had arrived in his town with a printer's box and opinions like sunlight through a narrow window, the kind that are specific and sharp, and illuminate exactly what they touch. Who had looked Harlan Doyle in the eye and printed the truth and scattered lead type across the floor of her office when someone removed her work without permission. Who had eaten 2-day-old coffee without noticing, and who argued with every editing suggestion he made, and who was right often enough to be frustrating, and who listened to him talk about his brother without looking away. He did not make a speech. He was not a man who made speeches. He brought her hand up, the ink-stained hand, and held it against his jaw for a moment, and she could feel the warmth of him and the roughness of the day's growth on his face, and he said quietly, "Then don't be." She was not careful. She kissed him over the compositor's stand among the type cases and the smell of ink, and it was not a gentle first kiss or a tentative one. It was the kiss of two people who had been very careful for a long time and had decided simultaneously to stop, and it tasted like coffee and like the specific release of something that has been held in check too long, and it lasted a while. When they separated, she said, without letting go of his hand, "There are still 3 things I have opinions about." "Only 3, he said, and this time the smile was the whole thing, not the precursor but the actual smile which she had not seen in full before and which was, she thought, one of the better things she had seen in recent memory. "Currently 3, she said. "The number is subject to change." "Print every one," he said. She did. The Redemption Clarion continued to publish every Thursday without exception. In August of 1879, it ran an editorial on the question of women's suffrage in Kansas that generated more letters to the editor than any previous issue. Virginia printed all the letters, the ones that agreed and the ones that did not, with a note that letters were printed regardless of viewpoint as long as they engaged with the subject in good faith. Clark's name remained on the masthead. It remained there in the months that followed, and it was understood by everyone in Redemption, and eventually stated plainly between the two of them, that the arrangement was permanent in more ways than the professional one. Doyle's influence in the county diminished over the following year. The court ruling had been reported in 2 larger Kansas papers, and the combination of that coverage and the ongoing Clarion reporting on land practices brought state-level attention to the county. An investigator from the State Land Office arrived in October and spent 3 weeks reviewing the records Virginia had documented. 3 of the land transfers Doyle had engineered through pressure were reversed. Adeline Marsh's family got their grazing rights back. Jesse Watkins, who had recanted under pressure and then come forward again after the defamation ruling, was mentioned by name in the state investigator's report as a key witness, a fact that Virginia printed prominently. She and Clark were married in December of 1879, not in the Methodist Church, which Virginia thought was a perfectly fine institution but had asked her to leave a meeting, and she was not the kind of person who returned to places that had asked her to leave as though nothing had occurred. They were married by the county judge on a Wednesday afternoon in the office of the Redemption Clarion, with Mabel Greer as witness and Paul Ichter, the attorney who had become a friend, as the second witness. Virginia wore her good dress, which was deep blue, and Clark wore a suit he had cleaned and pressed for the occasion, and which fit him with the kind of precision that suggested he had owned it for some years and kept it carefully. He had brought her a small bunch of late autumn flowers he had gotten from somewhere she did not ask, dried goldenrod and the last of the season's daisies, which was the kind of thing she had not expected from him, and which she kept afterward, pressed between 2 sheets of paper in the storage cabinet. She did not change her name. Clark had not asked her to. When she put it to him directly, he had said, "Virginia Walker is the editor of the Clarion." "Walker is on the building. Why would you change it?" She had looked at him for a long moment and then said, "You are going to keep making this difficult," meaning the opposite, meaning thank you. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was cold and busy. Virginia was running the paper with Clark's continued help, expanding its coverage, adding a section on county agricultural news that drew subscriptions from the farming communities east and west of town. They lived, the first winter, in 2 rooms above the hardware store that Clark had been using as his own quarters, which were spare but clean and had good light from the south-facing windows, and Virginia set up a small writing desk by the largest window and did her editorial work there in the mornings before walking to the Clarion office. She learned his mornings. Coffee first, then silence for 30 minutes while he read whatever he had on hand, then conversation, then work. He learned her mornings, which involved an immediate and comprehensive engagement with the newspaper from the moment she was awake, forming opinions over breakfast that were usually in printable form by the time she finished her coffee. He adapted to this without complaint. She adapted to his need for 30 quiet minutes by doing her thinking and writing during that period rather than aloud, which improved the thinking. In the spring of 1880, they moved into a house 2 blocks from the Clarion office. It was not large, but it had a proper parlor and a kitchen and a room that Virginia designated as a secondary office for home use, and that Clark designated as the room where he would put the bookshelf he had been building for 6 months from a particularly good piece of walnut lumber he had been saving. They had their first serious argument as a married couple in that house in May, about a story Virginia wanted to run regarding the treatment of Chinese railroad laborers who had been brought through the county during a survey for a proposed rail extension. Clark did not object to the story. He objected to the fact that she had been conducting interviews for it for 3 weeks without telling him, not because he had a right to know every story she was working on, but because 2 of those interviews had been in locations outside town that she had traveled to alone, which in the context of a county where Doyle's influence was diminished, but not gone, was not without risk. The argument was genuine and loud and involved Virginia, making a point about the difference between editorial independence and marital surveillance that she delivered with considerable precision, and Clark making a different point about the difference between surveillance and reasonable concern, about someone you loved traveling alone to isolated locations to interview people connected to contentious labor questions, which he delivered more quietly, but no less forcefully. At the end of it, they had agreed on 2 things: that the story would run and should run, because the conditions the laborers described were genuinely inhumane and needed to be on the public record, and that for interviews conducted outside town, Virginia would tell Clark where she was going and when she expected to return, not because he would stop her or approve her plans, but because being married meant someone knowing where you were, and that was a reasonable thing to expect. "That is the first concession I have made to marriage," Virginia said when they had finished arguing. "It's a small one," Clark said. "I know, that's why I made it." He had kissed her forehead, and she had let him, and then gone to finish the draft of the story, which ran the following Thursday, and which was picked up in part by the Topeka Daily Capital, marking the first time a Clarion story was reprinted in a state paper. She showed him the reprint with a restraint she was proud of, and he looked at it and looked at her and said, with that dry understatement she had come to love in the specific way you love the particular texture of the person who is yours, "I suppose the Clarion will be getting above itself now. It was always above itself, she said. That was the plan. The summer of 1880 was when Virginia discovered she was expecting their first child. She was, characteristically, matter-of-fact about it with herself, and less certain about how to tell Clark, not because she thought he would react badly, but because it was a large thing, and she was conscious of the largeness of it in a way that made her quieter than usual for 3 days before she told him. She told him on a Sunday evening. They were sitting on the back porch of the house watching the Kansas evening light go golden across the flat land, and she said, without preamble, because preamble was not her style, "I am going to have a baby. I expect this will happen in late January or early February." Clark was quiet for a long moment. She watched him, watching the light, working through whatever he was working through. Then he turned to look at her, and his face had the expression she had no category for, the one she had never seen on anyone else's face before him, the one that was him unmistakably in the same way the particular dry tilt of his humor was him. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "Yes," she said immediately. "You?" "Yes," he said just as immediately. They looked at each other. "I would like to not be careful about this either," he said. "Neither would I," she said. He took her hand. The same ink-stained hands, though hers had been washed and his had sawdust in the creases, and they sat on the back porch in the Kansas evening and were not careful about being frightened together. The baby was a boy. He was born the 3rd week of January 1881 in a hard winter, and Virginia's labor was long, attended by Mabel Greer and the town doctor. Clark waited in the front room of the house, which was the longest night of his life by his own account, related later to Paul Ichter with the particular economy of language he used for things that had cost him greatly. They named the boy James, for Clark's brother. Virginia had suggested it. Clark had accepted it without speaking for a moment, and she had understood what that cost him and what it meant to him that she had offered it. James Walker Donnelly was born into a household that smelled of newspaper ink and fresh-cut lumber and coffee, which seemed to suit him. He was a solid, attentive baby who grew into a solid, attentive child, who from the time he could walk had strong opinions about being in the print shop, which Virginia regarded as entirely appropriate. The Clarion continued to grow. By 1882, it was a twice-weekly publication. Virginia hired a typesetter, a young woman named Ruth Acaffer, who had learned the trade from her father in Ohio, and who had answered Virginia's advertisement for a compositor with a letter that was so good Virginia had immediately written back to offer her the position, causing Mabel Greer to say over dinner that Virginia was building an institution. "That's the idea," Virginia said. The hiring of Ruth Acaffer caused comment in some quarters of Redemption, because Ruth was black, and Kansas in 1882 was a state with complicated and contested racial politics, having been a free state before the war but having developed, in the years since, the kind of ambient discrimination that did not write itself into law but practiced itself socially. Virginia had anticipated the comment and had printed a short piece in the Clarion about it, noting that she had hired the best compositor who had applied for the position and that she intended to continue doing so. Clark had read that piece in proof and said, "Good." That was all. She did not need more than that from him, which was one of the things she loved most about him. Ruth turned out to be not only an excellent typesetter but a gifted proofreader and eventually a writer, and her column on the practical matters of homesteading life became one of the Clarion's most read features. She became a genuine presence in the paper's life, and over time, in the life of Virginia and Clark's household as well. Harlan Doyle died in the fall of 1882 of a heart condition that had apparently been advancing for years. Virginia wrote his obituary, which was factual and not cruel, noting his business history and his considerable practical impact on the development of Redemption, while also noting the court case of 1879 in measured and precise language. Several people told her she was too generous. Several others told her she was too hard. She thought she was accurate, which was all she ever aimed to be. His son, a man named Thomas Doyle who was 35 and who had spent his adult life in his father's shadow, and who seemed, upon introduction, to be significantly more interested in reconciliation than in continuation, came to the Clarion office 2 weeks after his father's funeral and asked to speak with Virginia. He told her he was not going to pursue any of the disputes his father had left behind. He told her he intended to renegotiate the loan terms on the mortgages his father had been using as leverage. He told her he thought his father had been wrong about a number of things. Virginia listened and then said she appreciated him saying so and asked if he would be willing to say it on the record for publication. He said yes. She printed it. It was a good story. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was when Clark told her the rest of what had happened after the war. She had known the outline, the loss of his brother, the years of difficulty, the decision to come to redemption. She had not pressed for the rest, because she had learned that Clark told things when they were ready to be told, and that pressing did not open things faster but only created pressure. She waited, which was not her natural mode but which she had developed specifically in the context of him. He told her one night in February when James was sleeping, and the house was quiet and they were sitting with the fire, and what he told her was not sensational, no dark hidden crime or dramatic betrayal, but something sadder and smaller and more human. That he had spent 2 years after the war in a kind of paralysis, living with his parents in Missouri, and being unable to build anything or commit to anything, watching himself not move forward and not knowing how to change it, until a day in the fall of 1872 when he had read a piece in a Louis paper about the settlement of Kansas, and something in it had suggested direction, the way a compass suggests north, and he had packed everything into a wagon and come to redemption. The piece was by a woman, he said, a correspondent. She had been to Kansas and written about what she saw. She wrote it like it mattered. Did it work? Virginia asked. I'm here, he said. She thought about that for a while, the long thread of it. The woman who had written a piece in a St. Louis paper in 1872, and the man who had read it and the direction it had given him that had eventually brought him to a print shop, where a woman threw a compositor's stick at him and they had built something together. I think writing has a longer reach than we know when we're doing it, she said. I think so too, he said. That's why it matters that you do it. She rested her head on his shoulder, which she did not do with any frequency because she was not a person who rested her head on shoulders as a general rule, but she did it sometimes with him when the evening was right and it felt like the accurate thing, and she felt him settle slightly beside her, the way he did when she did that, the particular quality of stillness that was him at ease, which she had learned to read like type, knowing exactly what it said. In 1883, Virginia was elected to the Redemption City Council. She did not run for election in the traditional sense, as women were not eligible to vote in Kansas state elections, but the city council had, through a procedural quirk of its original charter, a different provision, and Paul Ichter had researched it thoroughly and confirmed that there was no legal barrier to her serving. She ran, in the informal way of local civic life, by simply being Virginia Walker and having been Virginia Walker in this town for 4 years, and she was elected by the council members with no opposition after the only opposition candidate withdrew, citing a business commitment in Wichita that no one entirely believed. She did not stop running the paper. She announced in the Clarion that she would cover the council's proceedings as a journalist and serve as a council member, and that she was aware of the apparent tension in that arrangement and intended to manage it with transparency. She invited letters to the editor on the subject. The letters she received ranged from enthusiastic to skeptical, to one from a farmer outside town who wrote that he didn't see the problem since she had been effectively running the council's public relations for 4 years anyway, and might as well have a seat, which she found the most satisfying response. Clark attended her first council meeting and sat in the public gallery with James, who was 2 years old and managed approximately 14 minutes of good behavior before needing to be taken outside. Clark reported afterward that James had enjoyed the horse tied to the post outside the council hall very much, and that Virginia's opening remarks had been, in his assessment, characteristically direct. "High praise from you," she said. "The highest," he said, meaning it. Their second child was born in the spring of 1884, another boy, whom they named Thomas, which was a name that had been Virginia's father's name, and which she had carried with her for some time in the category of things to be used when the time was right. Thomas was a loud baby where James had been quiet, and he had opinions from the moment he arrived, which Virginia took as a sign that the universe had a sense of humor about inheritance. "He takes after you," Clark said. "Good," said Virginia. "He'll need it." James, at 3, accepted his brother with the seriousness of a child who had decided this was his responsibility and intended to discharge it carefully. Virginia watched him stand beside the cradle with one hand on its edge and something in his face that looked already like the careful watchfulness that was his father's clearest expression, and she thought that whatever they were building was working, whatever it was. This life assembled from printer's type and flat iron stock and opinions, printed without apology and coffee gone cold in the middle of a deadline. The Clarion reached its 5th anniversary in 1884. For the occasion, Virginia wrote a long editorial about what she had hoped to build when she arrived in Redemption with $4 and a printer's box, and 3 opinions about everything. She wrote about what the press was for, the specific and non-negotiable obligation it had to be inconvenient, to exist in the uncomfortable space between power and the public, to be the record that power could not erase. She wrote about Redemption itself, about Adeline Marsh's bakery and Ruth Acaffer's column and Thomas Doyle's renegotiated loans and Jesse Watkins, who had stayed in the county and was farming a piece of land he now held clear title to. She wrote about being frightened and being brave as not opposites. She did not write about Clark in that editorial, because some things belonged to the parts of life that were not the paper's domain, and she had learned, not without difficulty, to honor those distinctions. But she showed him the draft the evening before she set the final type, which she did sometimes with pieces that mattered, and he read it at the small table in the kitchen while James sat on the floor with a block of wood and Thomas slept in the next room. When he finished reading, he was quiet for a long time and she did not press him. "The paragraph about what the press is for," he said finally. "The last sentence of it. What about it? It's the best thing you've ever written." She looked at it again. The sentence read, "The press does not exist to comfort those in power or to validate those who read it, but to be the inconvenient thing in the room that no one can ignore, the type set in permanent form, saying what is true whether or not anyone was ready to hear it." "I've written better sentences," she said. "Maybe," he said, "but that one is true in the particular way that very few sentences are true." She took the draft back. She looked at the sentence. Then she looked at him. This man who had come from a Missouri paralysis to a Kansas hardware store, because a woman's newspaper piece had suggested a direction, who fabricated press parts from flat iron stock and redistributed her type without permission when he was afraid she would be in a burning building, who had stood beside her masthead and her compositor's stand and her city council seat without once suggesting she should want less, who held her ink-stained hand over the compositor's stand on a July afternoon and said, "Don't be careful," and meant it. "You are going to ruin my editorial detachment," she said. "You don't have any," he said. "That's why the paper works." She laughed properly, the way she laughed when he was specifically right, and he smiled, the full smile, and James looked up from his block of wood with the seriousness of a 3-year-old who finds adult amusement baffling. And Thomas stirred in the next room with a small sound, and the kitchen smelled of coffee and the cold evening and the very faint trace of ink that she was not sure she would ever entirely wash from her hands. The 5th anniversary issue sold every copy. Ruth sold them out of a basket on the street corner and had to turn people away. Virginia ordered a second press run for the first time in the paper's history. Clark came home that evening to find her sitting at the kitchen table with the anniversary issue in her hands, and a look on her face that was satisfied and complete in a way he associated with a press run gone right and a story told truly. "Good day," he said. "Very good day," she said. He sat across from her. James was in bed. Thomas was in his cradle in the next room, asleep, finally, after a substantial performance of not sleeping that had occupied most of the late afternoon. "I want to tell you something," Virginia said. He waited the way he waited for her fully. "When I came here," she said, "I came for the paper, you know that." "I know," he said. "And the paper is everything I hoped it would be and then some," she said. "Ruth and the subscribers and the city council and the stories, all of it." "Yes," he said. "And you," she said, "which I did not plan, which I did not expect, which happened in the way that the best things happen, which is sideways while you're looking at something else." He was quiet. "I want you to know," she said, "that what we have made here, the two of us together, it is the thing I am most proud of, more than the paper. More than any story, more than the anniversary issue or the defamation ruling or the city council seat." Clark looked at her. The lamplight was warm on the table between them. Outside, redemption was going about its evening. The town they had both chosen, both built in their different ways with their different tools. "Virginia," he said. "I know," she said, because she did know, the same way she knew the things he did not say but fully meant. She had learned to read him the way she had learned to read type, by the weight and placement of it, by what it said and what it meant to leave in and what it meant to take out. He reached across the table and she put her hand in his, the hand that was still, no matter how many times she washed it, faintly ink-stained, the permanent mark of the work, and he held it the way he held it with the particular steadiness of someone who intended to hold it for a very long time. "Print everything," he said. "I intend to," she said. Outside, the Kansas night settled around redemption. The Clarion office on Main Street stood dark and quiet, the press still for the night, the type locked in its forms and ready for the next issue. The masthead, freshly printed on the anniversary edition stacked in the back room, said what it had said since July of 1879. Virginia Walker, editor. Clark Donnelly, publisher. Permanent. As permanent as anything gets. The next year brought a third child, a girl this time, and they named her Frances, for Virginia's mother. And Frances came into the world with the same loud insistence that Thomas had brought and a look in her eyes from the very first week that Mabel Greer described as knowing, which Virginia took as further evidence that the universe was making jokes. James, at 5, approached his new sister with the same gravitas he brought to all important responsibilities. Thomas, at 1, approached her with the enthusiasm of someone who had not yet learned that not everything in the world was his. Frances faced them both with equanimity. Clark had expanded Donnelly's hardware by 1885, adding a lumber yard on the south end of town that employed 4 people and served the growing building trade as redemption grew. He managed this quietly and efficiently and without drama, which was his way. He was known in redemption as a man who was reliable, who kept his word, who would sell you quality materials at a fair price, and would tell you honestly if he thought you were making an error in your construction plans. He was also known, increasingly, as the husband of Virginia Walker, which he wore as a title he considered more distinguished than any other he had been offered, a fact he had stated plainly once at a town meeting when someone introduced him as Redemption's most prominent businessman, which he had corrected by saying that the paper's editor was considerably more prominent, and he was just the man who fixed her press. Virginia had heard about this from Paul Ichter secondhand and had not said anything to Clark about it for a week, and then had said, entirely casually in the middle of a different conversation, "Ichter tells me you corrected someone at the town meeting about who's prominent in this household." "Did he?" Clark said, without looking up from what he was reading. He found it amusing. "It was accurate," Clark said. She looked at him for a long moment. "You are going to keep making this difficult," she said, meaning the opposite, meaning exactly what she had meant 3 years earlier, the accumulating specific gratitude of being known and allowed. Ruth Acaffer married a man named Daniel Hurst in 1886, a teacher from the county school who had courted her carefully over the better part of a year, and who had, Virginia noted with approval, read every issue of the Clarion in sequence before he first introduced himself to Ruth, which suggested a man who understood what mattered to her. They were married in May, and Virginia wrote about it in the social notices and felt, writing it, the particular warmth of having watched something good grow in the vicinity of something she had built. Ruth continued at the paper after her marriage. There had been no question about it, not from Virginia and not from Daniel, who understood that Ruth's work was not a phase to be moved past, but a vocation to be accommodated, which Virginia recognized as its own form of the rare gift she had received in Clark, the gift of being allowed to be entirely yourself in the presence of someone who had chosen you for exactly that reason. By 1887, the Clarion was Redemption's paper of record and had a circulation of nearly 400, which for a twice-weekly in a Kansas county town was substantial. Virginia had been offered, twice, the opportunity to sell it, once to a group of investors from Topeka who wanted to fold it into a larger regional paper, and once to Thomas Doyle, who had no intention of interfering with its editorial policy, and simply thought it was a good business investment. She had declined both times with the courtesy and finality of someone who was not going to revisit the question. She was 34 now, and the paper was 8 years old, and she was exactly where she had intended to be, which was not where she had expected to find herself, because she had not expected Clark or James or Thomas or Francis, had not expected redemption itself in the way it had become hers, had not expected that the thing she built for the purpose of making truth public would also make a life for her that was full in the particular way she had not known she was missing. She wrote about this, eventually, not in the paper, but in a letter to her father in Cincinnati, who had sold the Register and was in his 70s, and had, in the years since her departure, come to understand something about what he had done when he sold it without consulting her, in the way that people sometimes understand things they have done when they can see the shape of what the person they did it to has made of themselves despite it. He had written to her on the Clarion's 5th anniversary to say he was proud of her. It was the first time he had said it. She had sat with the letter for a long time before writing back, working through the old hurt and the older love and the complicated arithmetic of forgiving someone without pretending the wound was not real. She had written back and told him about James and Thomas and Francis and about Clark, whom her father had not met, and about redemption, and about what the paper had done and continued to do. She described Clark in the way she described everything, precisely and without excess, but the precision of it communicated something her father had apparently heard clearly, because he wrote back and said he sounded like a man who deserved her, which coming from her father was the highest compliment he knew how to give, and which she accepted in that spirit. Clark read her father's letter. She had given it to him because she gave him things she did not give other people, the same as she always had. He read it and said, "He's right about the press, and I hope I am what he says." "You are," she said. "Don't fish for it." "I'm not fishing," he said. "I genuinely hope it." "I know," she said. "You are." He folded the letter and handed it back, and she put it in the cabinet with the pressed goldenrod and daisies from their wedding, in the growing collection of things that were permanent in the way they both believed in, not fragile permanent but actual permanent, the kind that persists because it is true. On a Saturday in September of 1887, 8 years almost exactly after Virginia Walker had arrived in Redemption with $4.30, and a printer's box and opinions about 3 things, she and Clark sat on the back porch of their house in the evening light. James was 6 and reading on the porch steps, a serious child who had learned to read early and voraciously, and who approached books with the same careful attention his father brought to everything. Thomas was 4 and running somewhere in the yard with the energy of a boy who had not yet found the thing that would focus him, but was fully committed to finding it. Frances was 2 and sitting in Virginia's lap with the placid authority of a child who knows where she belongs. The Kansas light was the same as it always was in September, golden and specific, the kind of light that made the flat land look like it had always been there and always would be. Clark had his coffee. Virginia had hers. The yard smelled of late summer grass and the very faint iron of the cooling air. "I have an opinion," Virginia said. "I know," Clark said, "about the rail extension story. I think we've been covering it too neutrally. The survey findings are being used to justify route placement that benefits certain land interests, and I think we should name that directly." "I agree," Clark said. She looked at him. "You didn't even think about it." "I thought about it Thursday when I read the survey summary you left on the kitchen table," he said. "I was waiting for you to say it. You could have said it." "It's your paper," he said. "It's our paper," she said. "Then you could have said it, and you did," he said. "Same result." She looked at the Kansas Evening. Frances shifted in her lap. James turned a page. Thomas appeared briefly from behind the garden fence, ascertained that no one was watching, and disappeared again. "I'm glad I came here," Virginia said. "I know," he said. "I'm glad you were here when I arrived." "I know that too," he said. "I'm glad you pulled my story," she said, which surprised her slightly as she said it, the completeness of the circle of it. He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not glad I pulled it," he said. "I'm glad you threw the compositor's stick." She looked at him. "It was the first time I knew for certain," he said, "that you were going to be the most important person in my life. A woman who throws a compositor's stick for her principles is a woman you build your life around." "That is an extremely specific romantic criterion," she said. "I'm an extremely specific person," he said. She reached across the porch rail and found his hand, the way she found it in the evenings, the ink-stained and sawdust-creased hands of the editor and the publisher, the woman who had come from Cincinnati with $4 and a box of type and 3 opinions, and the man who had been waiting in redemption for something to build toward. They sat like that until the light went out of the Kansas sky and the stars came in, and Thomas came back through the garden fence with grass stains and no explanation, and James finished his chapter and said it was very good and could he have another, and Frances fell asleep in her mother's lap with her fist curled around the fabric of Virginia's dress. Clark carried Frances inside. Virginia brought the boys in for bed, arguing briefly with Thomas about the grass stains and losing, because Thomas argued with the committed energy of a child who had inherited something from his mother and knew it even if he could not name it. She kissed James goodnight, and he said solemnly that the chapter had been the best one, and she said she would tell the author when she saw him. She and Clark stood in the hallway of their house in the dark after the children were settled, in the quiet of a house that was sleeping, and she looked at him in the faint light from the window at the end of the hall. "The rail story," she said. "Thursday," he said. "I want to lead with the survey numbers, then the land interest connection." "Yes," he said. "Good. And I want Ruth to write the sidebar on the farming community impact. She's been talking to the homesteaders east of town." "Even better," he said. She nodded. She turned toward the bedroom. He followed. "Virginia," he said as she reached the door. She looked back. "I love you," he said. He said it the way he said the things that were true, without preamble, without performance, with the specific weight of something meant exactly as it is stated. She looked at him in the dark hallway of their house in Redemption, Kansas, 1887, where she had come with $4 and 3 opinions, and had found a press and a town and a man and a life that was more permanent and more true than anything she had planned. "I love you too," she said. "Now come to bed. I have a story to plan." He came to bed. She planned the story. The Clarion ran the rail extension piece the following Thursday, and it was, by general consensus, one of the best things the paper had ever printed, because Virginia Walker had been right about the lead and the framing and the direct naming of interests, And because Ruth's sidebar captured the human cost with a clarity that made 3 different readers write letters to the editor that were worth printing in full. Clark read the issue on Saturday morning, the same way he always had, with coffee and that careful attention that she had first seen 8 years ago when he stood in front of her compositor's stand and looked at the type cases with an expression like recognition. He read to the end and set the paper down and picked up his coffee. "Well," she said. "The last line of Ruth's sidebar," he said. She nodded. She knew which line. "It's good." "It's very good," he said. "You trained her well." "She trained herself," Virginia said. "I just printed it." "That's what you do," he said. "Print everything." "Every one," she said. Outside, Redemption went about its morning. The Clarion office was 2 blocks east, the press waiting, the type in its cases, the empty forms ready to be filled with whatever the following week needed to say. The hardware store was a block north, the lumber yard south of town, the boarding house on Sycamore where Mabel Greer still held court over cornbread opinions, the bakery where Adeline Marsh sold bread and pastry from 6 in the morning, the school where Daniel Hurst taught, and where James Walker Donnelly would start in the fall. All of it their town, both of them. Built from truth and flat iron stock and printer's type, and the particular stubbornness of people who believe that what they are building matters and who therefore do not stop. Thomas came downstairs at a run and asked about breakfast with the urgency of a boy who experienced hunger as an emergency. Frances toddled after him with her fist around Clark's trouser leg as soon as he stood up. James came down last, already with a book, already somewhere else in his thoughts. Virginia looked at her family around the kitchen table and thought, with the precision she applied to everything, that this was the thing she had not known how to plan for, the thing that had arrived sideways while she was looking at the press, the story she had not known she was setting in type until it was already permanent. She poured coffee. She put bread on the table. She sat down across from Clark, and he looked at her across the bread and the coffee and the children and the Kansas morning light, and his eyes were the particular shade they were when he was exactly where he wanted to be. And she thought, with the same certainty she had about a well-set line of type, that this was right, that this was the truest thing she had ever had the privilege of knowing. She had come to the frontier with a printer's box and 3 opinions on everything. He had said print every one. And they had built from those materials the most important story either of them had ever told.